36 days to go until Election Day in America. And faced with a candidate who promises to turn the page on all of this, on his particular brand of politics, Trump is plumbing the depths with rhetoric that is so extreme and so nasty and deeply personal over every known and acceptable boundary. He's raising fears over where the wannabe autocrat who attempted a coup the last time he lost is trying to take his supporters this time. Here's what he said on Saturday about his opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris.
Kamala is mentally impaired. Joe Biden became mentally impaired. Kamala was born that way. She was born that way. If you think about it, only a mentally disabled person could have allowed this to happen to our country. Anybody would know this.
So he does that to shock us, right? To get us to say, look how reprehensible he is. But we're not showing you that for those reasons. I mean, it's exhibit number 10,000 of that, of his moral bankruptcy, as if we needed more proof of that. We're not showing it to you because he's crossed some new line, and it feels great about it, adding to his political resume that is now defined by his vile, often racist attacks, with particular venom that he saves up, stores up, and directs at black women, as well as his long-standing disrespect toward all people with disabilities, a particularly loathsome trait of his. It's all true. It's not why we show it to you. We show it to you for this reason. Watch how the elected Republicans respond to what he said. Here's the number 3 Republican in the House, Congressman Tom Emmer.
Do you think Kamala Harris is mentally disabled? Do you approve of that kind of language?
I think Kamala Harris is the wrong choice for America.
Congressman, do you approve of that language? Do you approve of that language? Donald Trump calling her mentally disabled, mentally impaired. So you don't approve of that? You don't?
I think we should stick to the issues. The issues are Donald Trump fixed it once. They broke it. He's going to fix it again.
Okay, then let's.
So I don't know Tom Emmer, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't approve of the language, right? But he can't say that. He can't say that to Martha Raddatz. So he relies on this, quote, we should stick to the issues. But comments like that from Tom Emmer are a test. And they're not a surprise. The Republican Party has made its bed, and it is going to lie in it no matter what. And every time Trump's Republican allies refuse to condemn something Trump says or dodge answers, dodge answering questions about his latest outrageous statement, in Trump's view, he can check them off a list. They've passed the latest test, the dictator on day one test from Trump. Trump tests them as often as he can so that he knows at any given moment just how far he can push and just how far he can go with his enablers in the Republican Party. He wants to make sure they're following along, following him to the depths as he goes lower and lower. It's ahead of an election in which Trump is already baselessly claiming that there could be voter fraud. It's a new chapter in a lie that has already led to one domestic terror attack on the United States at the U.S. Capitol. Trump is stress testing now to see how tight his grip is over the Republican Party. That stress test also includes calls for violence. On Sunday, Trump reiterated his call for Vice President Harris to be prosecuted. And as NBC News reports, it is part of a pattern. Quote, he has increasingly threatened to go after other political foes if he is elected. He has talked about jailing Facebook co-founder Mark Zuckerberg and discussed possibly carrying out election fraud prosecutions against election officials, donors, and operatives. Donald Trump's increasingly dangerous rhetoric as we get closer and closer to the election as a stress test for the GOP is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor joins us. With us at the table, full house, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, Alicia Menendez is back. Also joining us, distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude is here, and former senator, host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill is here. She's also monitoring the Mets game for me.
Bottom of the ninth.
Yeah, what do we got?
It's 8-7.
Okay. Thank you, Lindor. Claire, I think that we have followed the shiny objects for 9 years because they are indeed news, right? It is a news story. that he called the Vice President of the United States mentally impaired. But for him, it's also part of ignoring Lindsey Graham's advice. Lindsey Graham went out 4 weeks ago and said, I don't think he should insult her. A whole bunch of elected Republicans have been on TV for weeks telling him to stick to the issues and to try to brand her for her policies, not personal insults. This defiance is part of a test ahead of what is obviously a project that is already in motion from Trump's perspective, and that is to already sow doubt about the results of the next election. How do we respond to that?
I think it's really hard because clearly he is going places that even he has not gone before in order to get attention. He is desperate to grab attention back to, so the focus is on him. I think he was the most miserable time he's had campaigning, were the weeks on end where everything was about Kamala Harris and everything was about her vice president and about her fundraising numbers and about her crowds and about her convention. And now I think he's going to places that even I think some of us are surprised, this being mentally disabled. And I just have one question for Donald Trump. If she's so dumb and mentally disabled, how come she wiped the floor with you at your debate? Why could you not stand up to her? And why are you so damn afraid to debate her again?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't pass any of the tests of logic, and SNL had some fun with that as well, though you delivered it better. I wonder, too, Yamiche, what the Harris campaign, who has, I think, raised the bar on how to sort of diminish Trump and shrink him down to size. They've turned it into an art form. What is their thinking behind the scenes about this kind of rhetoric and these attacks?
Well, I think, one, they don't want to engage and really respond point by point for every single personal attack that he wedges on her. They really do want to, especially in this last, what will be almost a month of the campaign, really stick to the issues and focus on the voters, because she still has a lot of work to do when it comes to undecided voters. That being said, when I talk to people close to her, I talk to longtime campaign aides, they say that this is really just Donald Trump revealing himself over and over again to voters. And it really is showing that he's someone who, in their mind, not my mind, but their opinion, is unhinged and unqualified to be president. So the more he attacks her personally, the more he says stuff like she's mentally unfit or she, quote unquote, turned black, the more it really makes their case in their minds that this is really someone who is showing himself to be unpresidential and who is showing himself to also not really have something that sticks when it comes to his attacks on the vice president. And a lot of Harris aides that I talk to sort of get the sense that he's still searching for a way to really get at the criticism that he wants to get to for her. He hasn't really found, they believe, the issue that he really wants to settle on. And as a result, you see him instead going after these personal attacks. They also say this is someone who, for a very long time, has really personally attacked women, personally attacked people of color. So this also is just more par for the course in their minds. That being said, I think the politics here is that the vice president wants to, in this moment, first look presidential, which is why you're seeing her leave Las Vegas and go back to the White House to deal with this hurricane aftermath. Of course, she cares about this because she is the vice president, but also it shows her being able to do the job of the presidency. And then she's going to keep on trying to hammer at sort of everyday kitchen table issues that she thinks voters care about, and in some ways not get into the back and forth, because she wants voters to look at her and say, this is someone who really cares about me and cares about why I'm struggling and all of the different things that are worrying me every day when I go downstairs and I go to try to make a living in this country.
You know, there is something in both what Yamisha's saying and what Claire's saying. I mean, she wants another debate. We know that. I think Ben Rhodes sort of had that sense, too, from talking to some folks close to her, that she would really, the campaign believes she would benefit enormously from another debate performance like the last one. And she has this insult that's everywhere. I mean, there is an opportunity to do exactly what Claire just said and said, if I'm so impaired, why don't you debate me anywhere, anytime?
To your point, none of this is surprising, because we know what he thinks of women. We know what he said on the leaked Access Hollywood tape. We know what he has said about E. Jean Carroll. We know what he is telling us in his policies about our ability to control our own bodies. I think we got a preview of some of this when he was running against Nikki Haley, trying sort of workshop, calling her Nimrata, calling her bird brain. And so anytime he goes toe-to-toe with a woman, specifically a woman of color, he begins to devolve. in addition to everything you have laid out, the other reason I think it is important is because there is a small but meaningful subset of voters to whom all of that happened in the past. And it has not yet so fully shaped their thinking on him that they are prepared to make a candidate choice. So he continues to give them new data points, which is why Lindsey Graham and other Republicans are begging him. Voters have somehow forgiven you for some of the things that you've already said. Let's leave it there. And in this moment, when late deciders are tuning in and getting reacquainted with you, you don't need to remind them of the reservations that they had previously.
We're a little over a month away now from Election Day, 36 days to be exact, and we have some new polling, a new view of a potentially decisive factor in November, the Latino vote. That demographic now makes up the second largest eligible voting bloc in America. And our latest poll shows Vice President Harris has a 14-point lead over former President Trump among Latino voters. However, that is the smallest edge for Democrats in years. Let's discuss all of this with NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki at the big board. Also with us, NBC's David Noriega in the battleground state of Nevada, and MSNBC contributor Paula Ramos. And her brand new book is called Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America. But let me start with you, Steve. Give us the details of all this polling. Break it down for us.
Yeah, Anna, I mean, the key is what you were saying at the end there about, look, on the surface here, this is a 14-point lead among Latinos for Kamala Harris. But the key is the context. What has this looked like among Latino voters in past elections, in recent elections? These are the exit polls. You go back to 2012. Remember, Barack Obama was running for re-election. He won the Latino vote by 44 points. Hillary Clinton by 38 in 2016. Joe Biden by 33 in 2020. And then look here, that drop, the drop in that number down to 14 points now in our poll. This has been one of the key questions since 2020 when we saw Republicans make some gains with Latinos then. Could they lock those in? Could they expand them? Our poll suggests they may very well be expanding those gains they made in 2020. What's driving it? A couple of big gaps here. There's a gender gap. Among men, the Trump-Harris race is tied. Among women, Harris with a 26-point lead. Among Hispanic women, there is an age gap. Younger, under 50. Harris only ahead by 3 points. Over 50. Look at that. She leads by 30 points. Then layer those on top of each other. Gender and age, and you start to see more divides. Men under 50, Trump with an advantage of 9 points over Harris. Harris leads men over 50, women under 50, and then look at this. Harris's core group, Hispanic women over 50 years old. Look at the gap between Trump with young men and Harris with older women. A lot of room in between those two, a giant gap. And we also have this. We talk about an education divide. We talk about this a lot with white voters. It's become one of the big features of the white electorate. You see it here, starting to see a little bit with the Hispanic electorate. Men without a four-year degree voting for Donald Trump, they say, by a margin of 13 points right now. And again, women with a college degree go to the other end of things. It's 26 points for Harris right there. And we also have, this is interesting, a religion gap. Look at this. Among Catholic Hispanics, Harris is leading. She's leading big by 20 points. Among Protestants, total reversal. Trump leading by 26 points. So some of the gaps there, some of the sort of gaps between and within the group, they explain how it's only 14 total right now for Harris.
And so I want to go to David, who has been talking with some of these Latino voters there in swing state Nevada. And we know, David, that in this polling, economy is still the top issue for Latino voters, just like we've seen it across the broader electorate. What are the shifting views and some of these demographic notes that Steve just gave us tell us? And what does it look like on the ground there as both campaigns are trying to make inroads?
Yeah, Anna, so I am on the east side in Las Vegas, which is the Latino part of town. And I've been speaking to voters here for a few days, and a couple of things stand out. First of all, it is near universal that the first answer that I get when I ask people what is the main issue that they care about is the economy, particularly the cost of living, pretty much without exception. Beyond that, though, there is a diversity of opinions. And the impression that I've gotten from talking to people here is that this is a community that is torn between the two candidates. And as the polling shows, they're torn between the two candidates in two parties, more so than they have been in, the last 20 years. And that really comes out in talking to voters because they're torn within their households. They're torn within the community. They're even torn within themselves in choosing who they're going to vote for, which issues, which values are the ones that are going to ultimately guide their decisions at the ballot box. I want to play you clips from a couple of interviews that I did recently over the course of the weekend at a park very near where I am now, where there was a youth soccer league happening. We were talking to some parents, and I'm going to play you clips from two different interviewees, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I concluded from both. Take a listen.
I love what Donald Trump did for us as an economy while he was in presidency, and I don't know what she has to offer because she's new. So that's kind of like taking a chance on her, so that's what I mean. But I do like how she is doing a lot of things for small businesses.
The 4 years he was in office, we were doing good, absolutely good. Kamala, she's already in office and ain't done. And, there was more work too. We were able to afford things.
So that first voter, Griselda, she told me she's about 60-40 leaning towards Trump, but still very much open to being persuaded and open to hearing more from the Harris campaign. That second voter, Veronica, she is 100% in for Trump, but I also met her husband, who did not want to go on camera, and he says that he's voting for Harris and that they had an argument about that just that morning, the day that they met them. So again, households are torn, people are torn. As far as how the campaigns are reaching out to these people, the story there, Anna, basically is that the Democrats and the Harris campaign is vastly outspending the Trump campaign and has, I would say, a clearer vision of who this community is and how they're trying to reach them. Just as an example, they've spent more than $13 million on ads in Hispanic media markets. That's more than 20 times the amount the Trump campaign has spent on the same. They're spending also lots of money on field outreach. Of course, the question is, we don't know if that is going to translate to votes in November. Anna?
David Noriega, thank you for that fascinating slice of the Latino electorate that you brought us there in Nevada.
Prepare for dog fights and childless cat ladies. Tomorrow, Tim Walz and J.D. Vance will go head-to-head in the last debate scheduled before Election Day. The host, CBS, says it'll be up to the candidates themselves to fact-check each other, and the mics will stay hot for them to do just that. Joining me now, Stuart Stevens, chief strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. Here with me in studio, Warren campaign senior advisor and former campaign manager for Julian Castro, Maya Rupert. So, Maya, CBS says, well, it reserves the right to mute, but the plan is to let them have at it. What are you expecting?
I really don't know. When they made the decision not to fact check, obviously that means there's going to be a lot more back and forth. And I really think it depends on I think it depends on how J.D. Vance is going to show up. I think that if he is going to echo Trump's approach in this race, if he is going to repeat a lot of mistruths, I really do think that what we're going to see is honestly a lot of fireworks on stage, which I think makes for interesting TV, but not super helpful for independents who are watching this trying to understand what everybody is going to do. So I think there's an opportunity, and I think both of them want to come in and make an affirmative case. But I fear without any fact checking, we're going to see a lot of the need to do that in real time.
Yeah, and you never know how those swing voters are going to react to something that's aggressive. What defines overly aggressive? Stuart, NBC News reports that J.D. Vance's team has been honing his debate strategy for more than a month with these, you've heard them before, murder boards. They work through the tough questions. And we got a preview of his strategy from Minnesota Congressman Tom Emmer, who has been playing Walz in debate prep. Take a listen.
He's so good at being this folksy, nice, kind of down-to-earth guy until people get to know him and his policies. Once he understands that Tim Walz is just going to try and deflect and go into this folksy whatever, he'll hold him accountable. I think J.D. will do a great job.
How aggressive do you think, Stuart, J.D. Vance can be against Walz? He's got this, coach, folksy dad demeanor about him, although I don't think anybody is expecting him to just lie down and take it.
Yeah, look, I don't work for the Harris campaign, so I don't have to worry about lowering expectations, which I would if I was working for him. I think Walz is going to crush this guy.
Really?
J.D. Vance is a very unlikable human being. The more you see him, the more you don't like him.
He was very aggressive against Tim Ryan in the last Senate debate they did, and I mean aggressive. I went back and watched it. And he won.
Well, he also got 400,000 less votes in the top of the ticket, which is pretty extraordinary. I've never really seen that happen before. Perhaps the top of the ticket realized that if J.D. Vance won, he would be out there accusing Springfield of killing pets. Look, I think that it goes back to what is the premise of the campaign that Trump and Vance are running? What is it? What is the bargain they're striking with voters? Because that's really the message that J.D. Vance needs to deliver. Ideally, he would be in a situation where he's reminding voters, this is what you get, this positive that you get with me. And they failed to establish that because they really don't have anything, which is why Project 2025 has filled that gap. I think it's not a bad thing to spend some time watching these debates with the sound off. I think that you're going to end up feeling much more comfortable with Walz than with Vance, and that's hugely important.
Well, Maya, the Walz team is calling this debate the North Star, Camp North Star, because they say he just has to be himself. But again, what is himself? I mean, he can't come off as somebody who can't stand up for himself, who can't stand up for Kamala Harris and for their policies.
Right. And I think what we've seen of him, and I think what we will see, is that despite the fact that he does have this very affable demeanor, he's coach, that's all real. He has never shied away from defending Vice President Harris against attacks, putting forth the affirmative case for their campaign. So I think he actually really is in, I think, a pretty enviable place of being able to go up there, be himself, talk honestly about what they've been doing. Whereas I think J.D. Vance actually has a lot of work to accomplish on this debate stage, and I just don't know if he's up for it.
So, Stuart, J.D. Vance has had, let's say, multiple controversies since he was named the vice presidential running mate, though none, I think, as lasting as the comments about women and childless cat ladies. His wife, Usha Vance, has been involved in debate prep, and I wonder if you expect him to say what she has said, which was that this was taken out of context. He was actually saying it can be hard to be a parent in this country. What are you going to be watching for, because you know he's going to be asked about it?
Well, we know a couple of things. It's a really good question. We know that he can't contradict Trump. Trump won't allow that. He can't try to explain something for Trump because Trump would hate that. So their whole theory of politics has never backed down. So I don't think that he's very likely to say that he didn't mean this. He might say the media misinterpreted it. But, you know, just to step back, and God forbid I should give them advice, if Trump in his debate or Vance did this, if they went out and said, look, Donald Trump had never been elected to office before. He was a tumultuous president, but he's going to be a much better president next time. He's learned a lot. That would open the door to a lot of voters who might be tilting their way.
Okay, give me, what is the chance? Yeah, what's the chance that happens? 3%,
exactly.
2%, 1%?
Yeah, probably not that high. So that digs them into a strategy. And, you know, ultimately debates, I think, are sort of cases in front of a jury. And ideally, you ought to be able to end with your open, which is to say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to prove to you the following. If you ask, what is it that Vance is going to try to have to prove about Harris-Walz? That they're communist, that they're extremists, that they're people that want to, you know, have illegal immigrants have free transgender surgery every minute or something. I mean, there's no sort of coherent argument there. And I think Walz is, you know, he's a more experienced politician than J.D. Vance. He's debated a lot more than J.D. Vance. I would not underestimate his ability to come back at J.D. Vance with some very effective rhetoric.
There is a controversy that has involved Governor Walz, as you well know, Maya, about his military service. He did serve decades. But he said he carried weapons of war in war and then had to say, I misspoke. Is that a believable defense?
I absolutely think it is. And I actually think this is the kind of misspeaking or gaffe that we were sort of formerly used to, because it genuinely can be explained away. He wasn't trying to take credit for military service that he didn't actually serve. There's no argument about what he has done, what his service record is, and I think he can...
Well, there was a suggestion he served in Afghanistan when actually it was Italy.
Sure, right, but I think, the point he was trying to make there was not... He made those comments, I think, talking more about the use of these kinds of weapons, right? So I don't think that the issue there is that he was trying to take credit for a type of service as much as he was saying, as someone who has been in the situation, I can speak to this larger sort, right? So I think, again, I think these are the kinds of things that on a debate stage, you can say, this is what I said, this is what I meant, this is the point I was trying to make. That's what debate, I feel like that's actually what this kind of thing is best for. People don't know everything about him. It is his chance to go up and say, I misspoke. I think, again, when we're talking about Vance, the controversies he's been involved in, you can't say those were, he wasn't misspeaking. He said what he meant, and it's why it's been so impossible to unwind these comments. He very clearly believes the things he has been saying.
Maya Rupert, Stuart Stevens, thank you both. Tomorrow,
thank you.
It's going to be interesting. Yes. And in fact, Rachel Maddow and team will lead our special coverage and analysis of the debate between Vance and Walz. Be sure to tune in beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on MSNBC.
Big week in politics. Trump is sticking to his plan to avoid any more debates after the last one, which is a big deal because this is still a debate week, while Harris vocally challenging him to a rematch.
Their debate should not be the last word. I'm trying to debate Donald Trump again, and I think he should debate again. And as you say here in Las Vegas, I'm all in. I'm all in.
The vice president seems almost thrilled about the reality that she is all in, proposing another debate, and he is running from it. But you know the big news if you follow politics, because Trump won't do another debate. Usually there's more than one in the general election between the nominees. I can tell you that tomorrow, by the current schedule, will mark the last debate of this whole presidential cycle. The running mates, of course, facing off for the first and only time in their debate tomorrow. Senator Vance arrived in New York today. Governor Walz is in Michigan with his team. And we are told, just like the nominee debate, the running mate debate also has weeks of debate prep. Transportation Secretary Buttigieg stood in for Vance and Walz's preparations, while the House Majority Whip, Tom Emmer, also a Minnesotan, played Walz for Vance. Now, vice presidential debates are not known for deciding the race, but remember, these two campaigns are statistically tied in all the key swing states, which means even small developments, let alone a big gaffe, could still matter a lot tomorrow night. The Harris campaign is riding on momentum from endorsements right now. Some are expected and simply useful for a Democratic base, like the New York Times editorial board formally backing Harris today, which you can see here, along with the prestigious New Yorker magazine. Neither outlet was expected to go MAGA. Other endorsements for Democrats, though, have come through that would have been unthinkable before the Trump era. Top General McChrystal, who you see here, speaking out in his support for Harris today, or those big Bush Republicans like Dick Cheney and former Attorney General Gonzalez coming out for Harris as well. Now, that tough and controversial general, you might recall, was actually relieved of duty for brash criticism of Biden all the way back in 2010. Now, he's not only endorsing Harris, but speaking out in articles and interviews about her character, and the stakes.
When we look at Kamala Harris, we look at her history. She came up as a prosecutor, an attorney general, into the Senate. She has lived a number of experiences that I think builded someone the kind of character that's going to be necessary in the presidency. We should elect them for the character because we don't know what's going to come up.
You don't know what's going to come up. That's a person who's definitely exercised command positions, life and death. And this wider embrace of Harris by veterans of national security and conservative politics, these individuals, it is exactly what Vice President Harris discussed and tried to highlight before that big audience at the debate.
I actually have the endorsement of 200 Republicans who have formerly worked with President Bush, Mitt Romney, and John McCain, including the endorsement of former Vice President Dick Cheney and Congress member Liz Cheney. I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
Now, that was just then. The endorsements now coming in. Early voting is underway. And then, as for the more traditional Democratic support that I mentioned, that New Yorker cover and its endorsement making the rounds today, the magazine explaining that endorsement by calling Harris the sensible, humane, and liberal-minded choice, saying much of this is beyond debate. The Times endorsement notes that Kamala Harris is a contrast to Trump standing alone as a dedicated public servant who's demonstrated care, competence, and an unwavering commitment to the Constitution. Now, Harris is balancing campaigning with governing today. Just as last week, remember, she took time off the campaign trail to meet with Ukraine's leader amidst that war over there. Today, she canceled her campaign events and is addressing the devastation from Hurricane Helene. We can report that across the South, at least 116 people are dead, hundreds more missing. And you can see here just some of the thousands of destroyed homes and businesses that are visible here, the devastation. FEMA briefed the vice president on the rescue and recovery efforts. This photo is courtesy of her office, and she just late today spoke from FEMA headquarters.
And over the past 24 hours, I have spoken with Governor Kemp of Georgia, Governor Cooper of North Carolina, and many local officials. I have shared with them that we will do everything in our power to help communities respond and recover. And I've shared with them that I plan to be on the ground as soon as possible, but as soon as possible without disrupting any emergency response operations, because that must be the highest priority.
The vice president there discussing the priorities and what she learned in the briefing. For his part, Donald Trump visited southern Georgia in response to the storm and has addressed it. He also held rallies in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania over the weekend. And while Trump's aides and his Republican allies say there are many issues and policies to be running on, Donald Trump is doubling down on the rhetoric and the insults and conspiracy theories that he has long used as a political and PR kind of ploy to try to hijack political attention via outrage. Now, this is an old playbook. Sometimes what we're seeing over this weekend involves a more extreme version that we shouldn't normalize, but a more extreme version of what is fundamentally the same playbook. And that does present now familiar challenges. And this is true for citizens, for people in politics, for people in the press. When you're faced with this, when do you confront and fact check these kind of claims? And when do you decide, again, as a citizen or whatever role you see yourself, to decline the temptation of outrage driving overreaction to this individual? I can tell you the New York Times reports that Trump's weekend addresses were notably escalating the attacks. They were dark and often rambling. Other outlets fact-checking false claims and lies by Trump about his opponent and about immigrant communities. Trump also openly vowing to abuse government power, something we've reported on many times here, including the evidence of how he's done so in the past, sometimes rising to crimes, sometimes not. He darkly suggested that Kamala Harris should be impeached and prosecuted. So Trump is now, having crossed this next line about Harris, he's now publicly, loudly agitated for the prosecution of every Democratic nominee he's ever faced. The first one, Clinton, who drew more votes in 2016 but did not win the Electoral College. The second one he faced, the current president, who beat him handily. Remember, Donald Trump's first impeachment was over his convoluted and failed foreign plot seeking the prosecution of the Bidens in Ukraine, a place that has much bigger problems than Donald Trump's attempted bribery shakedowns. And now, completing this is Harris. And this part of what I mentioned is this tendency he has. It is larger than rhetoric. Donald Trump's plans to wield power in the second term are available for scrutiny. They are more extreme than the first term, with whatever you already think of the first term and know about the first term. And so it goes beyond rhetoric to his attempt to normalize what he would really do. But while I am being careful to mention these things and not treat them as just ignorable or normalized, I'm not playing clips or footage of the lies. One of the reasons that you have to be careful with ever taking Donald Trump live is precisely to review what is worth airing. And what I'm showing you to know about is not something that we think rises to the standards that we are choosing to air it. There are also politically, and this is a political race, signs that what I just referred to is not working anymore for Donald Trump the way it used to. It's possible politically that it helped Trump somehow in that very first time that he tried the move of vowing the prosecution of then Hillary Clinton, his nominee, the Democratic nominee. That was back in 2016. And remember, the Trump attacks also merged with what had been years of talk about both Clinton's legal issues, some real, much of it exaggerated, especially with regard to her. But now we're in the third installment of this. And if it is politically failing, which is a separate point from whether it is valid, acceptable, consistent with democracy or law, but whether it's politically failing, that brings us to how Donald Trump's own allies and other concerned parties in the GOP are knocking this. They don't think this is working. They think just about anything would be better.
I think we should stick to the issues.
I just think the better course to take is to prosecute the case that her policies are destroying the country.
I've said for years that Trump's divisive rhetoric is something that we could do without.
That's just a smattering of the reaction to the most recent. And so we are witnessing something here that is familiar and for some people might be fatiguing. Of course, a lot of important things can be tiring, but also has notes of a different possible outcome. Again, that always depends on everybody, you watching or listening to this, everyone else in the country who has a role to play. But it does have signs of something different. There is not a complete meltdown overreaction to every single thing he says or lies about, nor should there be. That's a journalistic assessment. And there is more of a concern creeping, growing in public among the people who still want Republicans to win in 36 days that this might not be it.
Vice President Kamala Harris visited the southern border on Arizona on Friday after getting a tour and briefings from border officials. Harris gave a speech calling for tougher border security measures. The vice president also called out former President Trump's inaction on border security. Take a listen.
In the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, he did nothing to fix our broken immigration system. He did not solve the shortage of immigration judges. He did not solve the shortage of border agents. He did not create lawful pathways into our nation. He separated families. He ripped toddlers out of their mothers' arms, put children in cages, and tried to end protections for dreamers. He made the challenges at the border worse. And he is still fanning the flames of fear and division. And let me be clear, that is not the work of a leader. That is not the work of a leader. And that is, in fact, I think we all believe, an abdication of leadership.
You know, recently, border crossings lower under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris than they were when Donald Trump left office. You would never hear that on the right.
Never.
Not on the Trump right.
The Trump right, my lord, the Trump campaign, different networks, they literally change those numbers and lie about them with wild abandon. Former President Trump.
What else you also will not hear, sorry to interrupt, but it's also important that people also remember, you will also not hear that Donald Trump killed the toughest border security bill in American history. And he bragged about it. And then he said to Republicans, blame me for killing the toughest border security bill in history. A bill that was written by Oklahoma conservative James Lankford.
So here's what he's now saying. He says he didn't use his influence to have Senate Republicans vote down the bipartisan border security bill earlier this year. A lie.
Another lie. We've got video, by the way.
Take a listen to those remarks from Saturday, followed by what Trump has actually said.
She said, I'm the one that talked him out. I wish I had that ability, that I was the one that said, don't vote for it. But I do have a certain say, but I would have never voted for that bill. I noticed a lot of the senators are trying to say respectfully they're blaming it on me. I said, that's okay. Please blame it on me. Please. Because they were getting ready to pass a very bad bill. And I'll tell you what, a bad bill is, I'd rather have no bill than a bad bill. I think they're making a terrible mistake if they vote for the bill. This is a terrible bill for our country.
Well, he said it was a terrible bill because it actually would hurt him politically. He did not want to give Joe Biden then and Kamala Harris credit for signing a bipartisan Republican drafted bill. That would have been the toughest border bill ever that was actually supported by border security, by border agents. They asked that the bill pass.
And it says a lot about Republicans in office in the House and the Senate who take his orders instead of what they claim they're fighting for. So it raises questions up and down the line in terms of Trump's hold. Joining the conversation, we have the president of the National Action Network and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, Reverend Al Sharpton, and MSNBC contributor and author of the book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, Charlie Sykes. Jonathan Lemire, Katty Kay, and John Heilman are still with us. And Jonathan Lemire, it's interesting. She spoke about that during her speech in Arizona. But do the people who are, understanding and following Trump's lies on the right ever hear what really happened? Do they ever get that information? I feel like Kamala Harris's surrogates need to show up in places where maybe they're not so welcome, but they need to have their voices heard.
Yeah, this is an interesting dilemma for the Harris campaign. How do you penetrate that right-wing ecosystem? Exactly. How do you penetrate that bubble? And as we've been detailing all morning long.
I mean, let's say it. How do you penetrate the lies? How do you penetrate the lies when you actually have Donald Trump now lying
about his lies?
Now lying, saying, "Oh, I didn't tell them not to support the bill." And of course, he was there all along. You were reporting on it. We were talking about it in real time. That Donald Trump was killing the toughest border security bill ever.
Yeah, he bragged about it. He posted on, beyond the clips we played earlier, he also posted on Truth Social repeatedly urging Republicans to oppose this bill. And he was because he knew it would wound him come November. And I think there are two things going on at once here. I mean, yes, Trump is lie after lie after lie, and we've cataloged them and how dangerous so many of them were this weekend. But we're also hitting another point about the Harris-Walz campaign. And our friend Mark Leibovich wrote about it this weekend in The Atlantic. There's a growing anxiety among Democrats. The Harris and Walz simply aren't there enough. They're not doing enough right now. That Trump, he's lying, and he took the summer off from campaigning, mind you. But since then, he's been relentless. He's everywhere, Reverend Al Sharpton. He's not taking tough questions. He's sitting for friendly interviews. He's up there lying. He's spreading dangerous falsehoods. But he's omnipresent, as he has been in the past. The Harris-Walz scene, now Walz has obviously been a little bit off the grid the last couple of days because he's preparing for tomorrow night's debate. That's understandable. But as Leibovich noted, both of them, there's growing anxiety among Democrats that the Harris campaign is treating them with kid gloves. They're not doing enough, not in terms of interviews, but also just events. They need to be everywhere right now. They've got 5 weeks. What are you hearing? What advice would you give them?
I'm hearing that they are really strategically laying out these last 4.5, 5 weeks, and their surrogates to really spread this out. And I hope that's true, because you must not get down, if it's a boxing match, to the last few rounds and then slow up, because that's where you can be in danger of getting knocked out or either counted out in terms of the scorecards. Donald Trump is going to try, out of desperation, because he's looking at these poll numbers, he's looking at the fact that he's not filling up these rallies like he used to. He's going to be all over the place because he's desperate. But desperation could lead to defeat if there is a relaxation on the side of the Democrats. And here's a softball for them. This is a blatant lie that he's telling about what he did or did not do in terms of the Senate bill that could have dealt with the border. But a lie doesn't matter if everyone doesn't know he lied and understand the severity of that lie.
Charlie, we've had a weekend of kind of lots of polls, and when you look at them and when you look at where we are in the race at the moment, it does seem to be tied. One area of vulnerability for the vice president is immigration, as we've been talking about. It's also men generally, men without college degrees, Hispanic men, black men potentially as well. What do you think the vice president needs to do at this stage of the campaign? Is it just getting out there more? Is it doing as she did, a podcast about sports targeted specifically at men? What would your strategic advice be to her at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure that she needs my strategic advice. I would urge the Democrats just to keep pointing at what Donald Trump is doing, what he is saying. Donald Trump is everywhere. That's absolutely true. But what is he saying? What are the American people seeing if they're paying attention to Donald Trump? And this was an incredibly dark weekend where you had, Donald Trump and, Jonathan Lemire highlighted this over the weekend, the incredibly inflammatory language that he's using about the day of violence, his increasingly racist attacks on immigrants. We're way past any kind of a dog whistle, and there is a theory out there that the more the race is focused on Donald Trump and his unhinged extremism, the better off it is for Kamala Harris and the Democrats, because Donald Trump has made a calculation that his base likes the dark fear, that they like carnage. He is calculating that he can make Americans afraid of migrants, because that's what he thinks about the American people. And we'll find out relatively shortly whether he's right about this. But right now, Donald Trump, I think, is melting down in front of our eyes, and the kind of rhetoric that he's using does not strike me as aimed at swing voters, if there are any swing voters. It does not strike me as reaching out to moderate Republicans who might have doubts about him. He has gone into a very, very dark place, and he's probably going to spend that for the next 5 weeks. And I just want to remind people that in 2016, he moderated in the final weeks of the campaign his message. He actually was not the focus of attention. And when the focus of attention is on Donald Trump, this kind of Donald Trump, he doesn't tend to do very well.
Yeah, and of course, the final week to 10 days, he moderated because he wanted to keep the attention on the James Comey letter, which swung the election for him. And so he just sat back and moderated. In this case, Mika, you'll remember about a month ago, we said his numbers are staying the same. He has a very hard ceiling. And we said, and other people had said, that Donald Trump could not win this election. He needed to make, and it was going to be his goal to make Kamala Harris lose the election. So he was going to have to destroy her. And this is what he thinks destroying her looks like. But calling somebody stupid that destroyed you in a debate, actually, is probably not the way to do it, especially when you can't answer the most basic questions about policy.